Welcome to Unlike-Minded, a sci-fi audio anthology.
Maven and the Monster by Nicki Holcomb. It was not a dark and stormy night. It wasn't even a cloudy day in November. That was what Maven loved most about grotesque and beautiful things. They could happen at any time, in any place. And so, it was at sunrise on a warm day in June, with bubblegum pink light spilling into the Gamma Mu house, that Maven's monster came to life. It had started with a volunteer shift at the nearby hospital. Maven was on the pre-med track and was determined to use her summer to rack up clinical hours. She hadn't envisioned herself zipping body bags over barely cooled cadavers while her sorority sisters sipped rosé on the campus lawn, but hey, the hospital was short-staffed. And besides, Maven could use the distraction. She had just gone through yet another breakup. Another disappointment, another forever that had turned out to be just for now. So, Maven held her nose through the stench and did what she was told all summer, even as her alabaster skin grew paler by the hour and her jet black hair lost its shine under the fluorescent lights. Until one day, she was unexpectedly rewarded with him. He was the most gorgeous corpse she'd ever seen. His body was almost perfectly preserved, with dark, wavy hair and green-blue eyes that somehow sparkled as they stared vacantly up at the ceiling. Those eyes. To Maven, they seemed to promise a depth, a warmth, an ability to love that she couldn't bear to accept was truly lost forever. But then there were the burns across his jaw and hands, where skin peeled away to reveal teeth and bone. Harsh reminders of what had sent him to the morgue in the first place. When she looked at his eyes, Maven half expected the corpse to sit up and smile at her. She found herself daydreaming about it, but then her eyes would rove across the torn skin that should have led down to his lips, and she'd remember he couldn't smile. This man was inaccessible, unavailable. He never would, never could fall in love with Maven. But then again, what if he could? On a wine-drenched night a few days later, Maven was curled up on the couch with Susie when she confessed her crush. Susie gasped, truly gasped, because she knew how rare it was for Maven to develop deep feelings for a man. So Susie proposed, quite suddenly and without a trace of irony, that Maven get up right now and go get her man. Susie was Maven's little sister, capital L and capital S. A bond well known to be thicker than blood. But Maven did not tend to put much stock in her dating advice. See, Susie was a simperer, a crier. She loved with abandon and then quickly abandoned herself. Susie's method for winning over a crush was not often a winning strategy. But then again, this crush was nothing like the others. With him, there were no games, no rules, no consequences. Maven could just be herself. So when Susie said those words, "Go get your man," something burst through Maven's drunken haze, lit up in glowing purple neon. Yes! The rest of that night was, frankly, a blur. Had they driven drunk to the hospital? Had they snuck into the morgue and dragged the body out the back alleyway? Had they held a séance over his corpse? Who could say? But in the morning, Maven woke up with her head pounding, and when she pushed herself groggily to the edge of the bed, there he was. A jump scare splayed out on her bedroom floor. Maven would have screamed if she were that kind of girl. Instead, she peered down at him, curious. There were those brilliant, lifeless eyes. But there were also changes. For one thing, he was dressed. They'd stuffed him into the flannels and sweats that lived in Maven's closet. Reminders of past relationships and compensation for Maven's wasted time. But the most noticeable change was on his face. Where his jawbone had been exposed, something new had been sewn jaggedly onto his face. Someone else's mouth and skin. A replacement for what had been burned away. Maven shuddered slightly, and not from the hangover. Flashes of last night flitted through her mind. Susie's sewing kit, a makeshift surgery, the strange seance. No, she realized, not a seance. It had been a love spell. Susie lit candles and Maven plucked roses from the trellis, and both of them chanted the words that TikTok swore could turn this corpse into Maven's perfect angel dream of a man. Part of Maven wanted to laugh at how drunk they must have been, because those lips were soft and plump, with a gently defined Cupid's bow, still a lovely shade of dusty rose. Those were women's lips they'd sewn onto her man. Maven scooted onto the floor to get a closer look. It wasn't so bad, really. Sure, the lips were feminine, but androgyny was in these days. And it was better than what he'd had before. Honestly, she marveled, it was kind of inspired. This fantasy had been unfurling inside of her for days, and last night she'd simply sewn him up like her grandmother's patchwork quilts and laid him out on her bedroom floor, unsupervised. Well, there was only one thing to do when you had your crush all to yourself in the glow of a beautiful sunrise. Maven leaned down and kissed him, soft and brief, a thank you for the surprise of being here with her. And wow. Maven had never been a believer in Disney romance, true love's kiss and all that, but the damnedest thing happened. He sat up. Maven stared at the corpse with wonder and disbelief. "Where am I?" he asked, all groggy and confused. But when he focused on Maven, his eyes seemed to clear, and a soft, curious smile spread across his brand new lips. It was even sweeter than Maven had dreamed. The days afterward blurred together like a movie montage. Shy smiles and hesitant kisses escalated into heated embraces and promises whispered long into the night. It could have been 4 days or 4 years, as Maven ignored calls about missed volunteer shifts and turned away sisters who knocked politely on her door, each time with a new excuse. Maven was sick. Maven was depressed. Maven was cramming for a non-existent test. But inside her bedroom, the two of them were building a kingdom of sheer bliss, a fairy tale romance, a forbidden love story for the ages. Maven told him everything, all her happiest memories and secret dreams. She even showed him her most prized possession, the glittering magenta-bejeweled pledge paddle Susie had decorated just for her, a sisterly tradition Maven kept tucked under her pillow to remind her of their unbreakable bond. Eventually, Maven even shared the bad stuff, the disappointments and letdowns, the boys who couldn't make her feel, well, anything at all. And he adored her, instantly. Of course he did. He had been dead and gone, an eternal black nothingness. And she had pulled him back into the world of sound and color. And maybe there were times when Maven grew just a little bit intoxicated on her own god complex. She had brought this man to life. But it seemed like drunken love spells might be the most effective. Because he was perfect. Almost superhuman. He never got hungry, never grew tired or felt pain. Maven couldn't believe she'd wasted her time with years of needy boys, when here was a man who didn't need anyone to take care of him. He didn't need anything at all. Against all odds, she even grew to like his face. He was hideous, all stitched together like that. But there was something romantic in his hideousness, wasn't there? After all, Maven had always sworn by one textbook dating rule: never trust a man with perfect features. Stick her in a dark room with an Adonis, and Maven would gag on the knowledge that this man had never struggled, never chased, never had to try. But a slightly ugly man? Now that was something she could work with. And while this man may once have been handsome, death had made him grotesque, a monster. In resurrecting him, Maven had made him uniquely hers, unlovable and ugly to all the shallow outsiders who could never understand. One day, she let the words slip fondly out of her mouth. My little monster. It was a pet name, yes, but also a subtle reminder that no other girl could want him the way that she did. The monster grew quiet, a crease in his brow. For an instant, Maven wondered if she'd pushed too far, if she would be forced to retract and insist the whole thing had been a joke. But no, the spell had worked. He really was her perfect man, because a smirk spread across those pretty lips, and the monster asked Maven to say it again. That same day, at golden hour, Maven told him her darkest secret of all. Gazing into his eyes, she admitted the truth that had weighed her down all these years. She had never truly believed she could love. Maven had carried that fear with her all her life, like a heavy stone that threatened to drag her to the bottom of the ocean. Even as she flirted and failed again and again, even as she tried on boys she knew were beneath her, even as she'd pined away for the one who would come and fill her cold heart with warmth, she'd never really believed it could be done. Until now. Until him. Maven was in love. They were snuggled in Maven's bed in their bubble of bliss when a banging on the door made them both jump. It was Susie, blubbering and begging Maven to let her in, or she swore to God she would break this door down because she just really needed her big sis. Maven's wide eyes met the monster's. She scrambled out of bed, and the monster allowed himself to be buried beneath a mountain of purple bedding and plushy throw pillows. Maven pulled open the door with a pasted-on smile, and Susie barged inside, wailing about how Stephen hadn't texted her back in the last 24 minutes. He clearly didn't like her, he'd never liked her, and she was more sure than ever that she was destined to die alone. Maven stroked Susie's hair and shot fervent glances at the bed until Susie mentioned, by the way, that Stephen had asked about Maven. That gave Maven pause. Her mind turned over the new information like a jeweler confirming the value of her Tiffany necklace. Stephen was hot. That was just an objective fact. Clearly, he didn't like Susie. Not that Maven would ever say that to her face. And sure, Maven and the monster had a good thing going here, but she was young. She was desirable. And most importantly, she was fully alive. So why couldn't she keep her options open? A blush of possibility crept up Maven's neck at the thought. Right then, Susie suddenly threw herself on the bed, right on top of the telltale lump, and the monster lurched up into sight with a cry of pain. Susie screamed, the monster screamed, and then Susie turned to Maven with wide, tear-stained eyes. "I forgot we did that," she whispered. Maven nodded. She'd been assuming Susie had blacked the whole thing out, given how much Maven herself had forgotten. Hesitantly, Susie went on. "But wasn't he dead?" "He was," Maven agreed, then smiled shyly. "But now I think he might be the one." Susie melted. She turned to the monster with renewed tears in her eyes. The monster smiled sheepishly from where he lay half prone beneath the pillows. "I am so happy for you," she cried, and flung her arms around Maven. Finally, Maven squeezed Susie out the door and locked it safely shut behind her. But when she turned back to the monster with a sigh of relief, to her surprise, he was frowning. She wasn't sure she'd ever actually seen him wear that expression, and it tugged at the stitching around his mouth, threatening to tear. "You blushed," he said quietly. "You like him." Maven knew the correct response to this accusation. She put a hand over her heart and did her best impression of being deeply hurt. "Of course I don't," she insisted. "How could you even think that?" But even as she said the words, she could feel a pinprick of heat forming in her stomach. Oh no. A single tear rolled down the monster's cheek. He's not a science experiment. He's not a secret. With him, you wouldn't have to stay locked up in your room every day. You could just be. Honestly, Maven thought those were good points, but she tried not to let that show. Instead, she scooted up next to the monster and insisted that he had nothing to worry about. What they had was special. She had made him into her perfect man. Who else could possibly compare? She stroked his hair and babbled more nonsense about their fated love, and by the third time she swore their connection had been ordained by the cosmos, the monster finally turned that frown upside down. But it was too late. The white-hot heat was already filling Maven's gut. She'd felt this before. She called it the bad thing. And God, she'd really thought this time would be different. She really believed she had found the cure for this. And yet, here it was, rearing its hideous head again after everything she'd done to avoid it. The ick. In Maven's defense, she tried to push through. For days, she kissed the monster through gritted teeth. She held his hand even when it made her skin crawl, and brushed it off every time he asked, "What's wrong, babe?" She insisted it was just the stress of starting school soon. It was allergies. She was PMSing, yes, again. But the truth was, Maven was devastated. She had really believed the monster would be the one to keep her happy, to finally measure up. She had manifested him. She had literally given him the breath of life. But even that no longer seemed sexy to Maven. It had started to feel gross. Instagram therapists had warned her about letting men parentify her. She had wanted to be his lover, not his mother. But now her affection for him had curdled like sour milk. Over and over, the bad thing rose up inside her, spreading from her gut to her throat, filling her arms until they felt like lead. Every day, Maven found new excuses to leave the room, to get away, anything to calm the bad thing for an hour or two. But one night, Maven came home to find her bedroom door open. Just a crack, just enough to make the hairs on her arms stand up. Slowly, Maven pushed it open the rest of the way, preparing for the worst. Inside, the room was untouched, not a lip gloss out of place. Yet the monster was nowhere to be found. Dread dripped down Maven's spine as she edged back into the dimly lit hall. She peered down the row of closed bedroom doors, searching for any sign of the monster. She tuned out the familiar giggles that always hummed in the background of the house, listening for something, anything out of place. And then she heard it, a barely audible gasp. From the door where a name was written in curly Q magenta, Susie. Maven's heart pounded in her ears as she threw open the door, and there he was, the monster, on all fours in Susie's bed, Susie's helpless body beneath him. His head whipped toward Maven, eyes wide. Maven's mind spun with panic. He'd hurt her, killed her, Maven's own little sister. But suddenly, Susie's eyes opened and met Maven's. And that wasn't fear in her eyes. It was guilt. Shit, Maven realized. This wasn't a murder. This was something much, much worse. Back in her own room, Maven slammed her door locked and wheeled on the monster. Her words came out as whisper screams. What the hell was he thinking? It was bad enough he'd gone out there, but for this? For Susie? At first, the monster fought back. He blamed her for leaving him alone, for trapping him in this empty hell she called a relationship, for refusing to admit she didn't even want him anymore. But that only fed the fire of Maven's scorn. When had he become such a baby? Why did he need so much attention and validation? What the hell had he done to her perfect, secure man? That's when the truth came spewing tearfully out of him. Had Maven really believed all that? Did she really think that the living, breathing person in front of her didn't need to eat, didn't need to sleep, actually liked being called monster? No. Every night he snuck down to the kitchen to eat scraps. Every morning he woke before Maven so he could pretend never to have slept at all. Sure, he was petrified of his own reflection, but he still smirked at Maven's horrible nickname because he knew that if he didn't, she would drop him. Just like that. Just like all the boys that came before. And sure, it was all very honest, and Maven knew she was supposed to want a man who expressed his emotions. But the whole time he was speaking, The bad thing was spilling out of Maven's gut, its vicious heat clawing through her whole body and screaming in her head until she had to swallow to keep it from bursting out her mouth. The thing was, Maven had been through this before. She knew there was only one way to make the bad thing go away. She knew what she had to do. So, as the monster continued to cry out, "I may have been dead once, but I am not anymore," Maven found herself reaching under her pillow for the treasured pledge paddle. "And I have a name," he sobbed. "It's..." But in a sudden flash of glitter, Maven whacked him across the head with all the strength Pilates could muster. He went down hard. From the floor, he gaped up at her in confusion and disbelief, too shocked to fight back. But Maven didn't hesitate. She climbed on top of him, pinning his arms with her knees as she smashed the paddle into his face again and again, wood crashing into bone and glitter raining down around her, until there was a satisfying crunch that sent blood spraying into her eyes. Gasping for breath, Maven looked down at what she had done, her knees in his blood, his body on her bedroom floor, as lifeless as the day she had found him. Sweet relief washed over Maven. Later, she might think of the carnage and feel sadness, even a tinge of regret. She might wish she could have made it work. But in this moment, all she felt was a gorgeous, sublime freedom. She took a deep breath and stood up. With effort, she dragged the monster across the room and opened her closet door. She didn't bother to glance at the other boys still piled in there, their bodies in varying stages of decay. She just dumped the fresh corpse onto the pile. She struggled a little to get the door closed behind him. She really was past due for a spring cleaning, but it closed with one last determined shove. Maven trudged into the communal bathroom. A pair of freshmen screeched a little when they saw her and scurried out of the room. Maven couldn't blame them. Once she saw her face in the mirror, covered in flecks of blood and glitter. For a moment, Maven studied her reflection. Another failed relationship. Another boy who didn't measure up. Tears sprang to her eyes. Susie's concerned face appeared in the reflection behind her. She was wrapped hastily in a robe, hair still mussed from her own tussle with the monster. "Maven?" she asked, tentative. "What happened?" Maven turned to her little sis. "We broke up," she admitted, finally letting the tears spill over. And then Susie was crying too. She was sorry, so sorry for everything. She had just been so lonely, and she had thought of Steven the entire time. She hoped the breakup wasn't because of her. Susie pulled Maven into a tight embrace, and Maven let herself be held. Eventually, Maven pulled back. "It's okay," she said. Wiping the mascara tracks from under her eyes, she shrugged simply. "I guess he just wasn't the one."
This has been Unlike Minded, a sci-fi audio anthology. Collection 3, Monster Mash, stories about creatures, chaos, and the supernatural. Maven the Monster was written by Nicki Holcomb and narrated by Eliza Helm. Unlike Minded is an August year-round production, created, produced, and edited by Robbie Hyne. We'd like to give a special thank you to everyone who has supported this independent podcast production. You can keep up to date and find more info about this podcast and others on Instagram at the handle AugustYearRoundProd, or email us at augustyearround@gmail.com. And be sure to subscribe, leave a rating and review, and tune in next week for another episode of Unlike Minded. Thank you for listening.